Hi friends, I'm Joe Hopkins, and this is 5 Minutes to Make Sense of the Bible. Today, we focus on Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16. There's a good chance that even if you don't read the Bible much, you've heard these verses in some form or another, most likely from the song This Little Light of Mine. But let me share some context and connections for these three verses and offer some avenues for reflection. In this passage, Jesus of Nazareth teaches a crowd that they are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Yet these verses are part of a long speech that Jesus gives very early on in his public ministry as a wandering rabbi, called the Sermon on the Mount because, according to verse 1 of chapter 5 of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus ascended a mountain and then gave very many different teachings, including the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, turning the other cheek, the Golden Rule, and many others. We can find the whole Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 6. A shorter but similar speech is recorded in the Gospel of Luke as well, in chapter 6, verses 17 through 49. And in Luke's version, Jesus came down from a mountain to a level place to teach. Thus, Luke's version is called the Sermon on the Plain. The Gospel of Matthew especially depicts Jesus as a rabbi, or Jewish teacher, in a similar tradition as Moses and other prophets of the Jewish tradition. Most scholars believe that Matthew's Gospel was written for a mostly Jewish audience who wanted to connect the way of Jesus with Jewish tradition. This is why the Gospel of Matthew opens with a long genealogy, which demonstrates that Jesus is a direct descendant of Abraham and King David. You'll also find that Matthew's Gospel interprets many of Jesus' actions as fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. Jesus is Jewish in all the Gospels, of course, but Jesus is especially Jewish in Matthew's Gospel. But let's talk more about the three verses at hand, Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16. Why salt and light? Salt was a precious commodity in ancient times, essential for preserving food that would otherwise spoil. Plus, as any cook knows, salt is a critical ingredient for almost every dish for enhancing other flavors. Thus, being called salt of the earth would have been a high compliment. As for light, its importance is pretty self-evident. We humans depend on our sense of sight more than the other four senses, and we need light to see. As Jesus says in verse 15, it would be foolish to cover up the source of light in an otherwise dark space. Yet light on its own is not much use. What we see is actually light reflecting off of other things around us. So we need to allow light to shine on as many things as possible for us to see them. Jesus uses these two sayings in a pair as an analogy for people's spiritual lives. If someone is the salt of the earth and light of the world, then that person allows others to perceive God's divine action in the world and in their own lives. It is good to be salt and light. Here are some reflection questions. 1. How familiar are you with the Sermon on the Mount? Which of Jesus' teachings from these chapters in Matthew's Gospel have impacted you? 2. Do you usually think of Jesus as Jewish? How important is Jesus' Jewish identity to you? And 3. How can you be metaphorical salt and light for goodness in the world? What are some ways that you can amplify peace, beauty, and kindness? So there, 5 minutes to make sense of the Bible. I'll be preaching a sermon based on these three verses in Matthew chapter 5 at Streetsville United Church on Sunday, so check out our YouTube channel for a recording of that worship service. As you read the Bible by yourself, pay attention to what piques your curiosity. The Spirit often tries to catch our attention through our curiosity. And as always, while it's good to read the Bible by ourselves, we make the most sense of the Bible when we read the Bible together. Peace, friends.